Welcome to the second episode of the In Conversation Roundtable discussion on the commercial determinants of health. What are they and why do they matter? Before we begin, I'd like to provide an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Centre for Health and Policies Research Translation and Health Promotion International acknowledges the traditional custodians of country all throughout the world and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Indigenous people around the globe today. This is the second series in the In Conversation Roundtable discussions, and I'll provide a little brief outline about what this series is about. The Centre for Health and Policies Research Translation and Health Promotion International Journal have partnered to develop and deliver the In Conversation Boundary Spanners, Thinkers and Policy Actors Roundtable series to raise the profile of topical and challenging societal problems and their potential solutions, with the aim of helping to progress understanding across the research, policy and practice communities and assist in moving each of these issues forward through increased collaborative and thoughtful action. Today's episode is the In Conversation Roundtable aims to better understand the commercial determinants of health and their implications on the health of our communities, the economy and market approaches. The episode will explore the potential for change within the current economic and political forces. And we're really very privileged to have three esteemed panellists, the boundary spanners, thinkers and policy actors lead our discussion. And I'll introduce each of them to you shortly. But before we start today's session, it seems timely to introduce myself and my colleague, Professor Evelyn Deleu, to do the same. My name is Carmel Williams, and I am the Director for the Centre for Health and Policies Research Translation and the Co-Director of the WHO Collaborating Centre for Health and Policies Implementation. Now, Evelyn, can I please invite you to do the same?
Thanks, Carmel. My name is Evelien de Leeuw. I'm the Director of the Centre for Health Equity Training, Research and Evaluation. I'm a professor there, and I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of Health Promotion International, which is the thought journal of the global health promotion movement. I have also been and continue to be involved in a lot of other health promotion initiatives, including Healthy Cities, and I've been the Director of the WHO Collaborating Centre for Healthy Cities Research in the past. I currently coordinate the Healthy Urban Environments Collaboratory. Back to you, Carmel.
Great, thanks, Evelyn. Now I'm really privileged to be able to introduce our three esteemed speakers who are going to be taking us on the journey of understanding the commercial determinants of health. I'd like to start by introducing Professor Sharon Friel. She's an ARC Laureate Fellow and Professor of Health Equity at the Australian National University and is the Director of the Menzies Centre for Health Governance. Sharon is an internationally renowned researcher in the social and commercial determinants of health equity. Welcome today, Sharon. Professor Fran Baum. Fran is a Matthew Flinders Distinguished Professor of Public Health and the Foundation Director of the Southgate Institute for Health, Society and Equity at Flinders University. Her service to academia and public health was honoured in 2016 when she was named on the Queen's Birthday Honours List as an Officer of the Order of Australia. Thanks for joining us today, Fran. And finally, Associate Professor Jonathan Liberman. Jonathan is at the University of Melbourne and is Associate Professor of Law and Global Health, with a joint appointment across Melbourne Law School and the Melbourne School of Population Health and Global Health. Jonathan is leading the collaboration with the World Health Organization, supporting countries in the Western Pacific in their use of law in responding to COVID-19. He's also been the founding director of the McCabe Centre for Law and Cancer. And welcome, Jonathan. As we start today's discussion, it seems helpful to outline the topic. So what are the commercial determinants of health? It's a relatively new field of inquiry, and so not surprisingly, there's no widely agreed definition. But I'm going to read out to you the definition from the World Health Organization, as it provides a more balanced approach to the role of commerce in how it affects our health and well-being. The commercial determinants of health are the private sector activities that affect people's health positively or negatively. The private sector influences the social, physical, and cultural environments through business actions and societal engagements. For example, supply chains, labour conditions, product design and packaging, research funding, lobbying, preference shaping, among many others. As we move forward today with today's discussion, this definition helps provide the framework for a number of the questions that we'll be exploring together. And as I will start with the first question to all the three panellists, and I'm going to propose that I invite Sharon, Friel, and then Jonathan, and then Fran to respond to the first question, which I'll read out now. So can I ask each of you to reflect on the definition I just shared, and can you please explain how you frame or define the commercial determinants of health? Why does this matter more broadly, and then specifically for health and health equity? And can I ask that maybe Sharon starts and then follows with Jonathan and Fran? So Sharon, over to you.
Lovely, thanks Carmel, and delighted to join colleagues on this very important conversation. I'll just acknowledge the First Australians on whose lands I'm meeting, the Ngunnawal people. So this really important area of the commercial determinants of health, the way that I would think about this is in a systems way. So the systems, the practices, the products of commercial entities and how they influence health and health equity. And to put it into the context of the systems as well as the practices and the products of the commercial entities, I think is quite important, because it reminds us that the commercial determinants of health infuse through society to affect health and health equity. It's not just, the things that we put in our mouth, or what we drink, or that sort of aspect, which is where the commercial determinants really sort of started the thinking around them. But for us to be very conscious of the whole suite of practices that these commercial entities use through their marketing, through their creating and influencing of science, through to their political activities and the lobbying and trying to influence the political environment, the way that they really sort of control across the global supply chains, which gives them incredible economic power to shape what happens within a whole number of services and products. Similarly, within the financial space, they influence the wealth and the measures that affect wealth and profit. And then, of course, they also shape our labour conditions. They are major employers, so of course they shape our labour conditions, and they try and make all of that seem incredibly good for us within society through their corporate social responsibility practices. So why does that matter for health and health equity? It really matters for health and health equity because, of course, it shapes our society, it shapes what we're exposed to, it shapes the policy and regulatory environment, it shapes our everyday living conditions, and as we know, all of that affects our health both through the material pathways and through the sense of control that we have over our lives. So a very, very important player and set of practices that affect health and health equity, and I think it's very important for us therefore to ask the question is, what is the role of the commercial sector within society, for what purpose? And I'm sure we'll pick up on that in our discussions.
Thanks very much, Sharon. That was really helpful to have that beginning our conversation today. Jonathan, I'd like you to reflect on the same question, which is, how would you like to frame and define the commercial determinants of health, and why do you think they matter for health and health equity?
Thanks, Carmel. And I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to take a really different starting point from Sharon, who started with a systems approach, and I'm going to start with a literal approach to the term, which probably reflects my training. So when I think about commercial determinants of health, I want to start with the definition of commerce, and this is a pretty standard definition. This one comes from the Collins Dictionary. So commerce is the activities and procedures involved in buying and selling things. I take the word things to be really the broadest possible term, so covering goods, products and services. The definitions are perhaps a little bit narrow because there are activities other than buying and selling, such as licensing and leasing. So I guess to state the obvious, there's an extraordinary range of actors who engage in commerce, actors of different kinds, of different sizes and structures, with different motivations. And there's an extraordinary range of goods, products and services that are bought, sold, licensed, leased, etc. So I want to say that I agree with the views of many who write under, I guess, the banner of commercial determinants of health, that the activities of large corporations that produce and market unhealthy products are extremely damaging to public health and indeed to democratic governance and to our planet, and that the impacts of commercial activities of these corporations are not experienced equally and generally follow socioeconomic lines. And I think that both people individually and people acting through corporate entities do really bad things in pursuit of profit, and that, broadly speaking, the bigger, wealthier and more powerful the entity, the more influence it can wield and the more harm it can do. But having said that, I personally struggle with the use of the term commercial determinants of health to describe these kinds of activities only, or for this to be the starting point from which we work outwards and kind of sometimes begrudgingly recognise that not all commercial activities are bad or as bad as these activities. So to me, commercial determinants of health should mean what that combination of words literally means. So it should refer to all of the ways in which commercial activities and procedures, from the definition I started with, affect health. And by this I include not only buying, selling, licensing, leasing, etc., but also the kind of activities engaged in to facilitate or support these activities. So the kind of activities that Sharon's already touched on, so whether it's workforce recruitment, employment conditions, supply chain practices, product development, R&D, marketing, public relations, lobbying, political donations, and so on. And so I just want to make just a couple of further points that help me make sense of the expression commercial determinants of health. So we all engage in commerce every day. Individuals, governments, academic institutions, NGOs, intergovernmental organisations, partnerships, small firms, medium-sized corporations, large corporations, multinational corporations. So it's not only the private sector that engages in commerce, and I think we're all commercial actors. And so I think so WHO's focus on private sector actors, I think I disagree with. I think we often then focus on for whether an entity is for profit, but I don't think this quite captures it either. There are really significant commercial actors that don't actually operate as for-profit entities. Not-for-profit entities that engage in commercial activities, often to raise revenue to support their worthy objectives, can also do harm through these activities. And I think we often tend to think of for-profit entities in particular terms. So we often think of large multinational corporations, but I'd say that my local general practitioner is also trying to make a profit. We look at the recent activities of certain cosmetic surgeons who are trying to make a profit. And yes, these are regulated as professions and for good reason, but I think they still have profit incentives and often profit motives. And then I think the last point that I want to say is that I think we often focus exclusively on the selling side of things, but the buying side of things in commerce is also important, as are investment decisions. And that's not just buying by individuals, but also buying by large entities, whether corporations or governments, that can really, I think, influence the activities of those they buy from or choose not to buy from. So just really briefly, why does it matter? I think conceptual clarity matters. It can allow us to be explicit about what we're focusing on and why, what we're not focusing on what and why, and to tailor our interventions and work out whether we want interventions that apply across the board or that are industry specific or sector specific. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. I think just listening to both you and Sharon to start with, and Fran will add to this, I think, shortly, it becomes clear that actually the term commercial determinants of health is a very complex issue, and that, as I said at the beginning, there's not kind of consensus yet on what we mean by it. And so I really, we are hoping that today's conversation will help us kind of drill down a bit more into perhaps what are those sort of common elements that we might be able to agree on, and where these differences lies. But now I invite Fran to add to this complexity.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Carmel, and I'm speaking from the unceded land of the Ghana people and pay respects to their elders past, present and future. Look, when I think about commercial determinants of health, I'm not thinking about a precise definition. Inevitably, the way anyone approaches this is going to be ideological, because that it reflects the sort of balance between the public sector, the private sector and individuals. And a US sociologist, Raymond Williams, talked about key words. And I think that we have to ask the question, why has the commercial determinants of health emerged particularly in the last 5 years, to be so important in our field of public health? And I think that's very clearly because after 30 years of neoliberalism, commercial entities, particularly transnational corporations, have gained much more power and influence, and there's a lot of concern about that. And of course, commercial can include, an informal seller in Kailicha in South Africa, for instance, in a township, and it can include the biggest transnational corporations. And clearly, public health is interested in commercial determinants because they can see many ways in which they're being harmful, particularly in terms of food and alcohol, tobacco, and of course, in the production of carbon as well. There are many ways in which, and not only, as Sharon said, this is about a system problem. It's not about those specific corporations, but they operate in a system where they can exert great political influence over governments and over international organizations. And what's happened in the last 30 years is that their influence has grown and the ideology of governments to govern them has declined. And I think what that means is out of this has emerged this focus on commercial determinants of health. It didn't just pop out of anywhere. It came because people were seeing the damages being done, the potential of continued growth, the potential of governments not being able to regulate many aspects of the largest commercial corporations simply because they had so much political and advocacy power. So you can't really understand the term unless we look at that historical development. And I think taking that approach that Raymond Williams does is say, why is this keyword emerged in the last 5 years is absolutely crucial. And along with it, of course, what's happened in the last 30 years is many activities that were previously in the public sector are now in the commercial sector. We see that in Australia in terms of aged care, disability care, and so on. And so it's not surprising that commercial determinants of health have come to the fore. And of course, there will never be consensus on what they mean, because how you interpret it depends on your ideological stand. And some commercial enterprises are state-owned, as in one of the largest companies, CHiAPRT, is listed on on the stock exchange as one of the largest entities, and that's entirely a state-owned entity. So we cannot come to this issue without looking at ideology, and I hope we'll be exploring that later in this conversation. You're on mute, Carmel.
Sorry, guys. Thanks very much, Fran. I think really the three of you have really highlighted, I guess, some of the inherent debates in the topic. And we, as I said earlier, we are really hoping to uncover these debates in a bit more detail and to be able to, you know, shine a light on some of the areas where we might be able to agree and the areas that require further discussion and further framing. As Fran has said, depending perhaps on our ideology, and uncovering some of those things a bit more explicitly. But now I'd like to turn to some of the individual questions that we have for each of our panellists. The first question will go to Sharon, and then following Sharon's response, I will invite both Fran and Jonathan to provide some reflections or additional comments, and then we'll move on to the other two speakers. So Sharon, the question that we have for you is, can you please think about and explain what you see, what role the architecture of the market economy has in shaping the corporate actions and the impact on health?
Yeah, well, so it's as Fran really was sort of picking up in some of her remarks, that whole the economic system really both facilitates and is shaped by some of these commercial forces. So if we think of the dominant, it's not exclusive to every place around the world, but the dominant market economy, the free market economy, really based on sort of capitalist principles of your private ownership of production, consumption, of maximisation of profit, then when we have an economic system that is predicated on those principles, then of course it is an enabling environment for commercial entities. Now, I think as Jonathan really has pointed out, is that's commerce. Commerce has been with us for a very, very, very long time. It's not a new thing at all. But when the system, when that market-focused economic system is based on principles that is providing and enabling the primacy of private interests, and particularly the profit interests over public interests, then that's certainly where I have a problem with that. Now, there's ways of mitigating that, but you know, that's a kind of to me a key issue. So if we have an economic system that has elevated the primacy of these private ownership, of private control, what it does is it creates a policy and a regulatory environment that is much more conducive towards those interests. So we have, particularly within the sort of the neoliberal paradigm, a much greater deregulation agenda. We have international institutions that have been set up to enable a deregulation agenda, a much greater economic integration around the world, a trade and investment liberalisation environment, which in theory poses all sorts of possibilities, but when it's not a fair system, that's where we start to see issues. So you've got a policy environment that pulls back from regulation. You have a policy and a regulatory environment that enables the market primacy, and in doing so shifts the focus towards an individualism approach to responsibility. And that economic system has normalised that way of operating really for the past few decades now. You know, that really ramped up in the 70s and the 80s. So when we say it's the problem of the commercial entities, that really is it's not the whole story, because we've got an economic environment, an economic system that is enabling. Now, of course, the commercial entities, and particularly the large commercial entities, benefit from that economic system, and so they work very, very, very hard to maintain that system, to maintain a deregulation agenda, to maintain a policy response that is about an education, a campaign. Think of all of the campaigns that we see around the world. And it's also an environment that makes it much less easy to advocate for change. So the economic system has also created the institutional environments that closes the door to some of the voices that would have something different to say about such an environment. So who's around the table is shaped by that economic system and those commercial entities in that system. So you have an economic system that normalises the private interests above and beyond the public interests, and you have an economic system that creates an institutional environment that helps to quiet those public interests as well. And so what that means is you have this beautiful environment in which the commercial forces thrive above, and for me that's concerning if that is above and beyond the public interests. You're on mute.
Sorry, that was that outlined, a number of concerns and really how the system has changed quite significantly over the years. And I'm hoping maybe as we move through the conversation, we can perhaps reflect on again, what are other alternatives? How could we do this differently in the future? So Jonathan and Fran, I'd like to invite both or one of you to respond. Fran, would you like to go first and then follow up?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Carmel. And I think, Sharon covered a lot of those issues really well. I mean, basically, we have a system globally that enables bad behaviour by corporations particularly. And of course, the elephant in the room that until COVID people haven't talked about is the whole issue of the form of capitalism. And there's a brilliant book by Nick Freudenberg that came out earlier this year, At What Cost? Modern Capitalism and the Future of Health. And there he looks at the ways in which many of the practices that are enabled, particularly by large corporations, are actually a threat to our health. And that's not just in terms of food, it's also in terms of our social relationships, the services we receive, and so on. And I think the question we have to ask about any economic system is who benefits from it. That is a crucial. And at the moment, despite all the rhetoric about trickle-down economics, that really hasn't worked. What we've seen in the world is an economic system that's creating huge inequities. And I think most people have heard of these huge salaries that the CEOs of corporations get, while at the other end of the equation, people have got less labour rights, they're working in gig economies, they're less likely to have permanent jobs. And that just hasn't happened by chance. That's happened because there's lobbying for those policies by these very powerful commercial entities. So there's a really clear task for us. Do we want a society that's driven by market forces and the pursuit of profit? Or do we want a society that uses regulation to maximise health, well-being, and also equity? And as I think most people listening to this webcast would know, inequity is really bad for our health as a whole. It has impacts not just on individuals, but on the whole level of trust in society, levels of mental health, drug use, and so on and so forth. So we really have to take a view of the whole system and look at how is this operating to affect all our health. And I think, a systems approach is the only way you can really do that effectively.
Thanks, Fran. Really well sort of, highlighting some of those issues that Sharon's already touched on. Jonathan, I'd like to invite you to kind of reflect on.
Yeah, I think probably what I'd say is I think we're largely in agreement. I think the difference is probably in how we see the relationship to the term commercial determinants of health. And I sort of don't want to waste time being too literal about that, but I guess the way I see it, which again probably reflects my training, is that that I see that those, and I want to come to this later when we talk about what are the responses that we need. But I see what both Sharon and Fran are talking about as sort of failures of regulation or failures of political leadership in responding to and regulating commercial activities. Now, whether that forms part of whatever commercial determinants of health means or not, we could spend a lot of time arguing about that, but I don't know whether that's the most important part of the debate.
No, thanks so much, Jonathan. I think probably we are wanting to sort of drill down to the areas where we think we do all agree on the problem, and it would be really helpful to be able to continue to articulate that. Perhaps you can also, because I think I'm now going to throw to a question to you, perhaps you can sort of touch on that a bit more in your answer. So the question is that some authors argue that the current rhetoric around the commercial determinants of health fails to acknowledge the positive health and societal benefits delivered through commercial activities. What's your perspective, and how can we balance commercial interests with the need to optimise health and wellbeing?
Yeah, so I would say that I do share that perspective, and as I've said, and Fran, I think both Fran and Sharon have said that commerce is everywhere. That there's so many different kinds of commerce and so many different kinds of actors, and there's good commerce and bad commerce, and there's commerce that it's hard to work out whether it's good or bad, and then both the direct and the indirect effects of commerce. So just a couple of points. So I think it's critical that we acknowledge how many people derive their livelihoods from commercial activities of different kinds, and we know how important having a job, having a livelihood is to health and well-being. Obviously, critical aspects of the social determinants of health, and relatedly, how much of a role employers, workplaces play in people's health and well-being in so many ways, both good and bad. And in these pandemic times, the role they play in trying to prevent or control the spread of a virus, enforcing vaccination requirements, supporting contact tracing, so on and so on. So I think your question is sort of how do we balance commercial interests or commercial activities with the need to optimise health and well-being. So I'd probably frame it a little bit differently, as I think it starts on the foot that there's always a bad that needs to be balanced with a good. So I think what we want to do as far as possible is steer commercial activities towards those that are good for health and relatedly good for our planet. And question how. So I do think a big part of this is awareness, understanding community, social movements, encouraging the provision of healthier, more public welfare promoting alternatives to harmful activities and products. And I think there are a lot of people who do want to do good, both in their personal lives and their working lives, not that the two are separate. But I'm also a big believer in regulation and taxation. But I think I'm saving the detail of that till a later question.
Well, I'd love to drill down and have a bit more of a conversation around regulation and taxation, but we'll wait to that summary question at the end. So Sharon and Fran, can I ask you, do you have any responses? Would both or one of you like to give some feedback to Jonathan or to take some of his ideas a bit further?
Well, I'm happy to. I mean, the one point I'd like to make is I think just about every article I've read on the commercial determinants of health does say that there are benefits from the commercial determinants. I don't, and the work we do in our team on looking at the corporate health impact assessment looks at both, looks at the positives and the negatives, and I think it's a bit of a sort of false economy, really. I think everybody recognises that employment can be good for your health, although there has been some research out of ANU showing that bad jobs are worse for your health than unemployment. So even that kind of is interesting. But it's really about taking a broad picture. So I just thought here of the example of coal. So, coal is good for jobs, but we know that if we take a broader perspective, coal is really bad for us. And we've seen in Australia how that whole debate about the commerce of coal has become such a politicised debate. Do we stress the fact that the world is heading headlong going into a climate crisis, and we say, no, we can't have that coal, and those jobs, those people have to find other jobs and we provide them with jobs and so on? Or do we fight like mad for that because of the benefit of jobs? But meanwhile, we're ignoring all the externalizations, all the external things that are created by having a coal industry. So I think that just shows that, yes, there are always some positives, but they have to be balanced by the risks that we're creating.
I was just reflecting as well. I suppose it's reminded me of the evolution within the social determinants of health field, where so why did that field really sort of start to emerge, and likewise, why did then the commercial determinants of health field start to emerge? So the social determinants partly came about because there was a recognition that there was something about at the societal level that was contributing to poor health. We were seeing all of these health problems, we were seeing all of the inequities in health, and all of the kind of individualized responses to those wasn't working. And so there was this recognition that there was something at the societal level. I think partly why the commercial determinants field has emerged was, so even though we've had all of this attention to the social determinants in the broad sense, and of course they can be good or bad for your health as well, but it was always about how can we understand and use the social determinants to address the poor health that we're seeing. I think it's the risk paradigm that we operate from in public health, isn't it? But in the commercial determinants of health field, it's been, look, we've still got all of these health problems. They're getting worse, and the inequities are getting worse. And as Fran was saying, I'm seeing the increasing power, concentration of power of some of these commercial actors. So I fully agree with Jonathan of the good and the bad, as it were, the good and the bad in everyone. I think there's a song there, isn't there? But for me, we've still got these health problems. In many instances, they're getting worse. In many instances, the inequities are getting worse. We've tried X, Y, and Z, or there's been attention to X, Y, and Z, and that's not really addressing it. What's happening within society that's really driving, and what is becoming clear, as Fran's saying, is this real concentration of commercial power. And from a public health perspective, that's not on, because we know it's causing problems. So I'm less concerned to speak about all of the positives, because I want to do something, or for us at a societal level, we've got to do something about the health burden that's just causing havoc in countries across the world. I was just trying to think of the evolution akin to the social determinants.
Can I come back in, Carmel?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, so just to say, I feel like I'm responding to some of the literature that I'm reading, which does frame commercial determinants of health exclusively in negative terms. I feel there is that literature out there, so I'm responding to that. And also I want to clarify, I'm not saying jobs in bad industries are good. But I just wanted the jobs and livelihoods are important, and I want to see good jobs, healthy jobs in good commerce, not any job in any kind of industry.
I think you raise if I may, Carmel, I think you raise a really important point there, Jonathan, because that transition, Fran was talking about coal, and so the transition, it's such a complex issue. The transition, it has to be a just transition, and we're seeing that across Australia at the moment of just all of the tensions within those coal mining industries and communities. And so it's the handling of that, but it's not so much about the industry. It's the handling of that has to be done really, really carefully.
So I think what's being highlighted here for me is that there are really inherent tensions, and that actually within the framing of commercial determinants of health, perhaps the public health interest is really focused on those aspects of the commercial determinants of health that we're beginning to understand are having long-term societal negative impacts. That doesn't mean that there aren't other aspects that commerce and the market bring that can be positive. I guess one of the things, just before I invite Fran to respond to her question, one of the things that I haven't been hearing, or perhaps was implied in the very beginning of our conversation, was the role of politics, and perhaps that's inherently built into the conversation about power, but I'm wondering whether we can perhaps start to explore that in a bit more detail as well. But Fran, I'll throw to you now, and I think your question, I think, does pick up and touch on this tension, really. It starts with free choice is a good thing, commercial entities would say. How do we balance individual choice with the need to take a population and health equity approach that works to achieve health for all?
Yeah, well, of course, this whole issue of individualism versus collectivism is at the heart of public health. It's a dialectic. There's a constant discussion between that. And we've seen this so clearly in all the issues surrounding responses to the pandemic at the moment. So there are people, thousands of people marching in Melbourne talking about their individual rights, and that for them that equals freedom. But of course, it doesn't take long to think, well, if you decide not to wear a mask and not get vaccinated, you're actually going to infringe my freedom in all sorts of ways. So it highlights the dialectic very well. And in terms of the politics of this, I was very happy to see Monica Kosinska, who's the head of the new Economic and Commercials Determinants section at WHO. Her pinned tweet says health is a political choice. She says that very clearly, and she's recognizing that that health is. And at the moment, individual freedom has become a very charged political word, not just in Australia, but in the US and in many countries around the world. And there is a very long history of commercial forces appealing to individual freedoms to enable them to market and advertise unhealthy products. You can think of the freedom to smoke where you like, the freedom to market alcohol to young people, making fast food that's really very bad for you look attractive. And of course, in the US, the right to own guns. And we've just seen another terrible school shooting in the US. That really has resulted from individuals saying, I have a right to own a gun. And then what happens after that is that gun deaths in schools have become prevalent in the US. Whereas in Australia, we've accepted the argument individuals might need a gun for some purposes, but we're going to restrict that because we know for society as a whole, it is much better. And as Evelyn would know, she was very much, we're both part of this history in the 1980s when there was a wonderful US person, a US former nurse called Nancy Melio, who said to us all, making healthy choices, the easy choices is what we have to do in society. And in order to make those healthy choices, the easy choices, regulation is, as Jonathan said, regulation is a fantastic tool to do that. And if you look at the history of public health, there's always a debate between individualism and collectivism. That was when we talked about seat belts, was when we talked about not smoking, it's when we've talked about banning advertising of fast food to children. But the general rule to me seems to be that there is initially this hullabaloo when people say, oh, I have a right to do this, I have a right to drive on the wrong side of the road, or whatever they might say. But in the end, it very rapidly becomes accepted behaviour. There's not many people saying, I have a right not to wear a seatbelt these days, for instance. So, as a society, yes, people get concerned, and there is a balance between individual rights and collective rights. But that balance, I think, at the moment has swung too far towards sort of individual rights. And we really need to think about, well, to what extent do we want individual rights to run roughshod over our collective rights as a humane society? And I was thinking about this, and in my book, The New Public Health, I actually quote people's views on this. And if you think about what Nelson Mandela said about poverty, and it's very clear that poverty is a political choice, but he said poverty and inequity are not a preordained result of the forces of nature or the product of a curse of the deities, but the consequence of decisions which men and women take or refuse to take. And I think we could apply that to how do we deal with commercial determinants of health? Are we just going to say, oh, this is what happens, societies get less equal, but in the end it trickles down when we know full well it doesn't? Or are we going to say, no, we want a sustainable society, we want an equitable society, we want a healthy society, and the road to get there does involve regulation and does involve promoting collective rights. And sometimes that does infringe on individual rights, but as a society, we decide that that's the way we want to go.
Thanks, Fran. It's really great use of the example of COVID. It's so topical and in our faces as we speak. South Australia at the moment is considering, shutting its borders again. So, a very real example and happening today. So, Sharon and Jonathan, would you like to have any responses to Fran's question?
I might just a comment. I suppose I do a lot of work in food and food systems, and I used to always, still do, get a lot of pushback from some of the food companies, the food industry, for around this issue of the people's choice, individual free choice, and my response, and they would say, that we're just making that so easy for people. My response to the food industry is always, when we go into our supermarkets, and I'm talking here in Australia, we go into our supermarkets and you look at the shelves. So whilst there may be more and more and more and more and more products available to people, those products are predominantly high fat, high salt, high sugar. So the choice has been curated by the retailers, particularly the buyers in the supermarkets, in collaboration with the food companies. So the idea of free choice, and you're saying it's about individual free choice, that's not actually been very truthful, because you, the industry, have created the choice for people already. So they're playing a that's not a fair game that they're playing there.
So you're suggesting, Sharon, that actually the range of products on offer in supermarkets is already predetermined by other market forces, and so the idea that people can go in and buy lots of healthy products, or have the choice to buy healthy or unhealthy products, it is not, as you said, it's not a fair choice, because actually there are aisles and aisles and aisles of chips and soft drinks and sweet biscuits and chocolates, as well as cans of soup and those other sorts of things.
Yeah, and when you think of all of the other practices that the commercial actors engage in to, one, get you into those retail outlets, and, if you have children, the pester power of children to want these particular things because they've seen it through the marketing. So it's just this thing of the companies don't want to be regulated, and they want the messaging from government to be individual choice and responsibility. But actually, we as individuals are being regulated by the companies because they've already decided what's there on the shelves for us. It's a very curated, in parentheses, free choice.
Really interesting perspective. Jonathan, did you want to have a response to Fran?
I think just to agree with both Fran and Sharon on what I take to be sort of two of the main points there, that those the tensions between individual rights and the rights of others, and population health, public health, but also what as Sharon was saying at the end there, that the so-called free choice is so heavily conditioned by commercial activities, or the relationship between commercial activities and failures of government regulation. I totally agree.
So now we're coming to that part of the conversation where I'm really keen to hear what might be some of the solutions, how we might be able to move forward. So this final question to all three panellists is, that we have discussed a little bit about the role of corporate power and perhaps that being at the heart of commercial determinants of health, and there might not be complete consensus on that. But then what is the way forward? We have talked about regulation and legislation. So what is the way forward to minimise the negative impact of the private sector? And how can we possibly do this within our current economic and market-led forces? Sharon, would you like to go first again?
Okay, let me try and drum up some hope. Well, no, I'm being slightly joking, but I do think there are possibilities. So one, there's no silver bullet. It's not one approach. Think about some of the thinking and actions that are going on in a number of countries around the world. So New Zealand, Scotland, for example, you're thinking about well-being economy principles. That's a way of starting to think about what we value within society and a policy environment to reach towards that. So that brings me some hope. We'll see whether that actually plays out. Is that just branding or does that have some possibility? But that's happening. There's discussions about an international treaty. So we've seen the effectiveness of the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. Jonathan will tell us about some of the real challenges to that. But there's an international treaty that creates and provides some a legal framework for countries. So would something like an international treaty help for the commercial determinants of health? I think just our regulatory environment at the domestic level, within countries, our regulatory environment that has teeth. So here in Australia, we've got discussions going on within our food regulators, really bringing public health much more firmly into the food regulatory agency. So there's an opening, there's a policy window opening to think about the regulatory environment. But we need some real teeth in terms of compliance and monitoring. Work that we've done has shown that the most successful regulatory policy intervention, this is in the food space, has to have compliance and monitoring mechanisms that are separate to the industry. It can't be done by the industry. I do think we see some new emerging business models that could be useful. Again, let's see whether that's just pure sort of corporate rebranding, but some regenerative business models. There's a whole sustainable business model field with some cooperatives, there's some B corporations as well, as they're called. And Jonathan mentioned the idea of the investors. I do take hope, certainly out of the new generation of investors, who are the younger generation, who are much more concerned particularly about the environment. That brings with it different principles and values into those investment decisions. And then, of course, civil society. I won't say much about it. I'm sure Fran Fran did a lovely webinar recently, getting inside the ways of working of civil society and how that can be incredibly successful for both reframing and shaping action going forward. Then the final thing that I would say is, for health actors, really having to break away from the biomedical model, the hegemony of that biomedical model. Some of us on this call are people who I think have broken away from that, as in public health here, but it's still the dominant model. So trying to foster and build the coalitions, there's the Doctors for the Environment, there's the I've gone blank. There are movements within the biomedical space that are thinking differently and working differently, building coalitions between these different actors that really builds a critical mass of voice in public health that says, no, that's not what the dominant approach should be, this is what it is. So multiple elements of a response, I think, that will address the commercial determinants of poor health and health inequities.
Thanks, Sharon. It was very pleasing that you mentioned the potential promise of the wellbeing economy, because that was Evelyn's and our first podcast or webinar was on the wellbeing economy. So it's lovely, we can see that these things are these big issues are linked and hopefully do create some hope. You've outlined a range of really, promising areas of interest. Jonathan, would you like to add anything, or do you have other alternate views or other suggestions, and perhaps unpack some of your thinking about how we can strengthen regulation?
Yeah, so I've already flagged, I'm a big believer in regulation of commercial activities, and including taxation, so both to prohibit harmful commercial activities and try to steer commercial activities as far as possible in positive directions. And as Fran already said, that idea of making healthy choices the easy choices. So I realise this is probably a bit of a regulatory wish list that I've prepared. Sharon, what did you say that you started with? A ray of hope. So I don't know how much hope I bring, but my wish list. So and I guess some of this does echo what Sharon's already said. So starting with strong consumer protection laws, which cover both product safety and the regulation of marketing, that's enforced by genuinely independent and sufficiently resourced regulators, and relatedly the judicious use of competition laws to try to reduce the size and power of large corporations. That regulation of marketing be behaviourally informed. So what does the marketing actually do and how does it operate? And rather than what we often see in the law with very narrow sense of whether something is literally false, misleading or deceptive. I realise this would do away with a lot of modern marketing. So apologies to those affected by that, whose creative endeavours would be impinged upon. Taxation of unhealthy or otherwise harmful commercial activities, while ameliorating the regressive effects. Taxes are often or generally ultimately passed on to consumers. That fundamental rights such as freedom of expression, of participation in government and political processes that were originally supposed to be the rights of human beings not be extended to non-human beings, just corporations, or to furthering commercial activities. And so we can go from there to also speak about rights of foreign investors under international trade and investment treaties, which in my view has gone much too far. More sort of generally applicable, but I'd like to see bans on political donations and the revolving doors between government officials or political staffers and entities engaged in harmful commercial activities, or industry associations that promote their activities. I'd like to see at least certain commercial activities, and at the very least those that involve interactions with governments or attempts to affect government or political processes, being subject to the equivalent of freedom of information laws, given their impacts on population health, the planet, and democratic governance. And I think the last point I'll make now is about intellectual property protections, that they go no further than necessary to incentivise creative endeavours for the public good. And I'm sure many people watching this will know about the proposal for a temporary waiver of the WTO TRIPS agreement in relation to COVID-19, vaccines, therapeutics and other health products and technologies. So the system embodied in the TRIPS agreement is, in my view, disastrously not fit for purpose. I think talking about pharmaceutical industry and products is probably in some ways a good way for me to finish these comments, because it really does show, I think, the complexity of commercial determinants of health. We're probably all glad, well, not probably, we're all glad that effective vaccines have been developed so quickly. And Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna are now household names. And yes, governments, academic institutions, public-private partnerships have made critical contributions, but the global inequities in access are just diabolical, and the profits of the companies, and I think Pfizer in particular, obscene. But I don't think that means that we say that the activities of these pharmaceutical companies have been exclusively harmful to health. The challenge here, and it's a really difficult one, is how to fix this complex system of intellectual property rights, profit incentives, power and size of the large corporations and public good, both in these times of global health emergency, but also beyond.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think you've highlighted, obviously another really great example, drawing on COVID to kind of showcase some of the complexity in where we are. Fran, can I ask you kind of perhaps to wind up this part of our roundtable discussion and conclude these kind of questions, and then we'll throw to Evelyn to do some reflections.
Yeah, well, I just make 4 points about the future. One is there is a UN guiding principles on business and human rights now, and they rest on 3 pillars. The state's duty to protect human rights is one, and we've talked a lot about that. The next is respect, which is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And I'd agree with Jonathan that the pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, who have increased their profits by 92%, hugely, are not being respectful. And then finally, the third pillar of the guiding principles for business and human rights is remedy, that people have got access to remedy if they're victims of business-related abuse. And I think we've seen that very clearly, for instance, in the Banking Royal Commission in Australia, where there was, banks were behaving very badly and there was a way of redress because we had a Royal Commission. The second point I'd make, and Sharon's talked about it a bit, but it's the importance of civil society. I think civil society acts part of the governance network that controls businesses and will very often point out the issues and problems, whether it's at a global level, advocating for this UN, eventually a binding treaty on business and human rights, or whether it's locally with local civil society groups saying we don't want another McDonald's in our community or something like that. So civil society, I think, is vital for the future. The third is that I think we need to evaluate all the privatisations that have happened in the last 30 years. When you look at the literature there's very little. There have been very few privatisations that have been thoroughly evaluated to see if they deliver on their claims of cheaper services, better services, and so on. And what evidence there is suggests that those claims were not met. And there have been trillions of dollars have been kind of outsourced and made people very, very rich on the back of what are essential public services. And I think part of that privatisation needs to look at the subsidies to industry. And in 2021, the fossil fuel industry in Australia received $10.3 billion worth of subsidy. So that is massive. And you can imagine if that was invested in public sectors, then very much could be achieved, especially for health and well-being. And then my final point is that I think we need to embrace some, well, what have been old models of economic activities like cooperatives, like smaller businesses that are really rooted in a community, that feel a responsibility to the community. They're not faceless corporate bosses. They're actually people who are known, who support their community in various ways. And I predict that in the next 10 years, there will be a flowering of those kind of smaller enterprises, because I think there's more and more public cynicism about some of the big brands. And, you know, you can just see lots of signs that local economies are becoming much more important. Farmers markets, people who work in the creative industries are very locally based. So that's the hope that Sharon's always looking for. And I think that's really important, that we do look for hope. And you know, if you had a flowering of those businesses and they could join together in cooperatives, but they involved the workers, you know, and they didn't seek excessive profits. They seek profits that will enable people to live a good life, but not enable them to be exploitative. I think that's got to be the hope for the future. And we need to look at all sorts of different ways of making those smaller enterprises flourish. It's happened in the past. The end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the US passed a lot of antitrust legislation, which had a good effect. And I think we need to start considering that now. How powerful do we want Apple to be? How powerful do we want McDonald's to be? And asking those questions, have they got too big for their own good and certainly for our own good? So I would leave that as some of the questions that public health professionals are going to have to tackle within the future.
Thanks, Fran. And just before I hand over to Evelyn, I think the idea of local businesses, interestingly, and I think that's something that started to emerge in the planning community as they want us to become, they're really looking at how they create main streets and how they can have small businesses so people can, you know, access these things, you know, within 800 metres or 400 metres from their home. So it's nice to know that in some ways some of these ideas are also, you know, coming from other fields. Evelyn, can I invite you to summarise the discussion as best you can and to provide some key points?
I can't. This was fantastic, and it was world embracing and quite significant. What I found was that there was a significant degree of realism to this discussion, because often what I see when people talk about things like the well-being economy or commercial determinants, that the language is magic language. Oh, it's bad. Oh, it's good, and that other words pretend to provide the solution. And one of the things that we discovered very early on in this conversation was that when we talk about commercial determinants, it's not just products that are bad for you. It's not just the one cigarette or a lifetime of cigarette smoking that's bad for you. It's how enmeshed certain practices are in affecting us differentially. And when we talk about the enmeshedness of private interest with public interest and how that creates an environment that is not necessarily good for health, or even worse, not necessarily good for our health equity. That is what we discovered, I think. So it's not just private sector, and it's not just commerce. It is how life on Earth, at virtually every juncture, is determined by an invisible capitalist hand. And people may believe, again, in a magic term, that there is such a thing like can-do capitalism, and that the invisible hand will work and will create freedom of choice for all of us. But as Sharon said, that is not the case. I attended, or I was a spy in a session about supermarket shelving. Supermarket shelving is an art and a science, and the people who arrange supermarket shelving actually know exactly how to manipulate people that go through the shelves. And eye level, go lower down. And that's a very particular example of a commercial determinant, but that same mechanism we find throughout society. It is in the purchase of homes. It determines even public transport, which is not a free choice. There are networks of transportation that are available to you or not, which is, again, not necessarily framed as a commercial determinant of health, but how public transport works and how active your transport can be is a choice that is not entirely free anymore. One of the things that I recently learned in another conversation, a term is urban acupuncture. People in urban health are looking at very apparently simple interventions in the urban space that have cascading effects. So where you start an avalanche of change. The Barcelona superblocks are an example of that, where you just close one intersection of roads, which has a vast cascading effect that has an impact on social capital across hundreds of thousands of people. And what you look for really in the solution to the issues of commercial determinants of health is that acupuncture point, that pressure point where you can start changing things. And I think that pressure point is politics. Now, again, there are many faux beliefs about politics, that it's vague and you can attribute it externally. It's not my problem. Politics is all our problem. If we say that the politics are failing us, well, we are failing ourselves. So we should mobilize, and we should, in the words of Fran earlier, we should actually go for the small-scale change that we see in the street out our own doors. However, of course, our farmers market or the collective over the road doesn't produce iPhone 20. If you really want those kinds of technologies, there are global enterprises. And again, we've been mesmerized by those billionaires who go into space and spend their fortunes on ephemeral pursuits, thinking, oh wow, that's good. I could once go into space thanks to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. No, we need to do something that addresses the injustice of that very behavior, the injustice of amassing obscene amounts of wealth that could have been spent better, not by those people, but spent by tax offices skimming off fortune that we see everywhere. So we've been mesmerized and hypnotized by that wealth and philanthropy, and I think we should look first and foremost how we could address commercial determinants in the streets, and by that create momentum to change the politics around us. And then I come to Jonathan, because Jonathan is a fan of regulation and taxation within reason. I think we need to show that regulation and taxation are good for us, rather than falling to the victimization rhetoric. That human rights, that remedy, that justice in society are dependent on a level of regulation and taxation that works for all of us. And the FCTC, for instance, to a very good example of how that would work at a global level. Now, whether that works at a local level is another example. And what I think we need, and I'm going to leave it there, is a reconsideration of Margaret Whitehead's and Jörn Dahlgren's rainbow model of social determinants of health. They recently published a wonderful paper reflecting on the success and failure of their own model. And they said, look, social determinants of health say very little about health equity or inequity. You need to have an additional level of thinking about how the determinants of health, including the social, but also political and commercial, affect a cascading differential effects across life courses, across cultures, across populations. And you start with how the current architecture of commercial determinants of health, or private-public enmeshed determinants of health, create differential power and resources and access to them. How that creates differential exposures, and I'm now really going into the Diderichsen model. How those exposures create different vulnerabilities across society, and how ultimately the effects of those different vulnerabilities hark back into a continuation of disadvantage in access to political structures, and our ability to change the architecture and the regulation and the resourcing of how we actually address what we, in shorthand, call commercial determinants of health. And I invite all of our panelists to very quickly reflect on this.
So, Jonathan, Sharon, or Fran, did you want to respond to Evelyn's commentary?
I mean, I'd say, Evelyn, I think that all makes sense. I mean, we, as you said, that, you know, we do benefit. You pointed to, I know you love your technology, Evelyn, so you want to ensure that keeps working, and that is important, and it's finding that balance. And I just think in the future, because we've now named and labelled the commercial determinants of health, the kind of thinking you're talking about will happen. And we will adapt models so that they do look at commercial determinants much more than just the social determinants. And as you stressed, and I think Sharon reminded us as well, there are different considerations when we think about equity. You know, it's one thing to think about health, but thinking about health equity is another step forward. And Carmel and I know from our work with South Australian public servants that really outside health, we found very little understanding of how these determinants could affect health equity. And it was a concept that rolls off our tongue very easily, but I think is much harder for the broader community to understand. And then when we start talking about, you know, the very upstream determinants of commercial determinants, and then, you know, have our program logics to link that to health equity, that's requiring a big level of understanding, I think, and there's a long way to go with that.
Thanks, Fran. I think that's, you know, obviously highlighting the challenges that health equity is something that's not well understood outside of the public health community, I don't think. Jonathan or Sharon, would you like to have any concluding words?
Well, I just think, Evelyn, that was a marvellous summary. How you pulled all that together. And I do just wonder if right now we have that moment to get a much greater understanding of health, social and health equity, given the visibilities of it from COVID-19, both in terms of, you know, the access to vaccines and the whole processes of the vaccine, but also just the wider impacts because of some of the other policy responses or lack of. So using this moment where we do see the real health inequities, you know, for us as public, but coming back to your point of really it's all about the politics, and we have such an incredible juncture between, you know, we might have a public and some parts of the political discourse around the social and health inequities right now, but an increasing global move towards populism. And, you know, the politics of populism do not lend themselves to the sorts of issues that we've just been speaking about. So I don't want to finish on a negative note after us being hopeful and identifying all of the some of the possibilities in your summary, Evelyn, but I do think, you know, and there's a role for civil society, for those coalitions to just constantly be speaking about pathways forward, the necessary pathways forward. Otherwise, populism will just sort of this moment of opportunity, I fear. So Jonathan, you're going to keep us hopeful, aren't you?
I will now, because you've instructed me to. So I think just sort of picking up, particularly where Fran was talking about the different kinds of sort of businesses or cooperatives that we might want to encourage, and then Evelyn, you made the distinction between I don't think you said farmers markets and the iPhone 20, but you made a similar distinctions. I guess probably this is where I started. So I would really like to see the commercial determinants of health field really look at. So I was saying both the kind of, so Sharon was talking about sort of looking at the negatives and saying that was partly the sort of public health risk approaches training. Is that, I think Sharon was saying something along those lines. So I would love to see something that really explicitly looked at, well, what are the kinds of commerce that we do want to see? And for me, that's sort of the hope in, I think, making that the literature a bit more inclusive, because there's something in that we sort of had these instinctive responses. We think, oh no, that we'd like to see more of that. But I'm not sure we know, or we've really detailed what it is about the things that we want to see more of. So that for me, that's a gap in this field. And I get that the commercial determinants of health has developed because there's a perception that commercial activities, large corporations' behaviour wasn't properly taken into account in social determinants of health. But yeah, for me, I would like to see that evolution in the field.
So what a great conversation. And I think to finish I think there is some hope, and I do feel optimistic because at least we're having the conversations, and these issues are actually being discussed and they are being published. And sort of to reinforce Jonathan's point, I think today's conversations really started to articulate that perhaps in terms of a public health response, we need to be really focusing both on and differentiating between those aspects of the commercial market system that we see as positive. So localism and buying locally and supporting local smaller businesses is an example that we've uncovered today, while at the same time really showcasing and highlighting very strongly on the challenges that are being presented by global corporations that are having more and more power and more influence over what our national governments can do, and how that's compromising the interest of human society as a whole and leading to increasing inequities. So Evelyn and I would really like to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you, Sharon and Fran and Jonathan, for your time and your great insights and contributions to our thinking on the role of the commercial determinants of health and the challenges put forward, but also I think providing us with some hope around and some directions around where to move to next. As a final statement, I just thought I'd read something that was in a recent editorial from The Lancet, and it said, it is time for a conscious attack on commercial interest and a radical rethinking of the dominant economic and political models that are too little interest in equity or social justice in order to improve population health and wellbeing globally. Systematic approaches to identifying, describing, and where necessary, disrupting the complex conditions constituting the commercial determinants of health are needed. I thought hopefully that kind of captures the breadth of the conversation we've had and sort of points us in the direction where to move forward. As a concluding statement, just to let people listening to this webcast know that we will be summarising the key messages from today's conversation, and we'll be publishing that as a policy brief in the coming months in the Health Promotion International Journal. But thank you, Sharon and Jonathan and Fran, for your great time and insights and contribution. And Evelyn, thank you again for partnering for us doing this great job together. And I'd like to say good afternoon.